We used artificial intelligence to create two thinkers.
Hi, I am believer in God.
Hi, I am atheist.
We placed these two thinkers face to face in a debate to discuss a very fundamental question. Are we born believers in God? Or are we later shaped, even brainwashed, by society, parents, and schools into believing? To make this debate more engaging and intellectually rigorous, we also brought in 3 AI models as judges, assigned to evaluate their arguments based on logic, clarity, and depth. Now, to uncover the truth behind this mystery, these two thinkers will step forward one by one. The debate begins with the believer's perspective.
The question, are we born believer in God or later on brainwashed by society, may sound simple at first, but when you begin to examine it carefully, it opens a doorway into something far deeper, the very structure of the human mind and the possibility that it was designed with intention. Let me begin from a theological perspective. In Islam, there is a concept known as Fitrah, which refers to the natural disposition of the human being. The Quran states, "So direct your face toward the religion, inclining to truth, the natural disposition upon which Allah has created mankind." This is not merely a poetic statement. It is a claim about human nature itself, that within every person, there exists an innate orientation toward recognizing something higher, something beyond the physical world. Interestingly, this idea is not isolated to Islam. In Christianity, there is a similar notion found in the writings of thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, who famously wrote that the human heart is restless until it rests in God, suggesting that the longing for transcendence is not learned but intrinsic. Now, if we move from theology into modern science, something fascinating begins to emerge. Cognitive scientists like Justin Barrett have conducted extensive studies on children across different cultures, and what they consistently find is that children are not neutral observers of the world. They do not naturally default to randomness or pure material explanations. Instead, they tend to interpret the world in terms of purpose and design. When asked why mountains exist or why animals behave in certain ways, children often say things like mountains exist for climbing, or rivers exist for animals to drink. They respond in ways that imply intention, as if something or someone designed things to be that way. Barrett goes so far as to suggest that children are, in a sense, natural theologians, meaning that their minds seem predisposed to think in terms of agency, purpose, and even divine causation. Now, this becomes even more interesting when we consider philosophical traditions. Plato proposed the idea that knowledge is, in some sense, recollection, that the soul already contains truths which it gradually uncovers. While this is not identical to religious belief, it raises a powerful question. Is belief in something greater a learned construct, or is it something the human mind is already inclined to recognize?
What you've presented is certainly compelling, and I agree that the human mind exhibits strong tendencies towards seeing purpose and intention. But I would argue that these tendencies do not point toward truth. They point toward how the brain evolved to function. From an evolutionary perspective, the human brain developed under conditions where survival depended on rapid interpretation of the environment. And in such conditions, it is far safer to assume that an event has an intentional cause than to assume it is random. This is where the concept of agency detection becomes crucial. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and cognitive scientists working in evolutionary psychology have discussed what is often referred to as a hyperactive agency detection device, a tendency of the human brain to attribute agency even where none exists. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, assuming it is a predator rather than the wind, increases your chances of survival. Over time, this bias becomes deeply embedded in cognition. Now, when you apply this to children, the picture changes significantly. Children are not natural theologians in the sense of discovering divine truth. They are simply expressing a cognitive bias, one that leads them to see intention and purpose everywhere. This idea is not new. David Hume argued long ago that humans have a natural tendency to project human-like qualities onto the world. We anthropomorphize. We imagine minds behind events. We create narratives where none exist. So when a child says, "God made this," it may not reflect an innate knowledge of God, but rather an unrefined cognitive system that has not yet learned to distinguish between real agency and imagined agency.
Your explanation may describe part of what is happening, but it still leaves something important unexplained. Because what we are seeing is not just a basic tendency to detect agency, like assuming a sound in the dark is caused by something, but a much deeper tendency to think in terms of an ultimate, unseen, and all-knowing cause behind everything. For example, children don't just say, "someone moved this." They often move toward ideas like, "someone made the world this way," which goes far beyond immediate survival instincts. Now consider a philosophical perspective. Alvin Plantinga argued that belief in God can be properly basic, meaning it can arise naturally in the human mind without needing proof, just like we naturally trust our senses or our memory without constantly questioning them. In the same way, belief in a higher reality may emerge as a normal part of how humans think. If we look at religious traditions, we find a similar pattern. The Bible says, "He has set eternity in the human heart," Ecclesiastes 3:11, suggesting that humans naturally feel connected to something beyond this world. In Hindu philosophy, especially in the Upanishads, there is the idea that the ultimate reality, Brahman, is reflected within each person, meaning the search for the divine comes from within, not just from outside teaching. So across different cultures, even though the details differ, people consistently believe in something higher, seek meaning, and think beyond the physical world. If this were just a mistake or a random cognitive error, we might expect it to disappear as knowledge increases, but it does not. It continues to exist across time, cultures, and even among highly educated people. So the real question is not just why humans make this error, but why this same pattern appears so consistently in human thinking everywhere.
This pattern continues to exist not necessarily because it is true, but because it is constantly reinforced through culture, upbringing, and human psychology. If belief were truly inborn in a strong and specific way, we would expect people across the world to arrive at the same understanding of God. But that is not what we see. For example, a child raised in a Muslim family grows up believing in Allah, a child in a Christian home believes in the Trinity, and a child in a Hindu environment may believe in many gods or reincarnation. This shows that while humans may have a natural tendency to believe, the actual form that belief takes is clearly shaped by environment and teaching. This idea is supported by researchers like Pascal Boyer, who argues that religion develops from normal mental processes rather than from any special access to truth. Similarly, Paul Bloom has shown that children naturally think in terms of mind and body being separate, which makes ideas like souls and life after death feel intuitive. But something feeling natural or intuitive does not necessarily make it true. Now, if we look at neuroscience, the picture becomes even more interesting. Experiments linked to Michael Persinger showed that when certain parts of the brain are stimulated, people can feel a strong presence, which many interpret as a spiritual or divine experience. If such feelings can be created artificially, then it raises an important question. Are these experiences coming from an external reality, or are they being produced by the brain itself? So the focus of the debate shifts. The real question is no longer just why people believe, but whether there is enough evidence to show that what they believe actually exists outside the human mind.
This is a fair and necessary question, but I would argue that explaining the mechanism of belief does not necessarily invalidate its truth. Let me draw an analogy. If we study vision scientifically, we can explain how light enters the eye, how signals are processed in the brain, and how images are formed. But this does not lead us to conclude that the external world does not exist. It simply explains how we perceive it. Similarly, studying the brain during religious experiences may explain how those experiences occur. But it does not prove that they are disconnected from any external reality. Now consider philosophical reflections on this issue. William James, in his work on religious experience, argued that such experiences should be evaluated not solely based on their origin, but based on their effects. their transformative power in human life. And from a theological perspective, one could argue that if a creator exists, it would not be surprising that human cognition is structured in a way that allows recognition of that creator. In other words, what you describe as a bias could also be interpreted as a designed sensitivity. And this brings us back to a deeper philosophical question. If evolution explains our cognitive faculties, then why should we trust those faculties to arrive at truth at all? This is a concern raised by Alvin Plantinga. If our brains evolved primarily for survival rather than truth, then our confidence in all beliefs, including scientific ones, becomes questionable. So skepticism, if applied consistently, does not only challenge religion, it challenges reason itself.
This is a powerful argument, and it deserves a serious response. But I would say that evolution does not need to produce perfect truth-tracking systems. It only needs to produce systems that are reliable enough for survival and interaction with reality. Science, importantly, does not rely solely on individual cognition. It relies on collective verification, experimentation, and correction. Errors are identified and refined over time. So while individual perception may be flawed, the scientific method compensates for those flaws. Now let me return to a more existential point. Friedrich Nietzsche challenged the idea of God not simply to deny belief, but to force humanity to confront the responsibility of creating meaning. If belief in God is not necessary, then meaning is not given. It is constructed. And that may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. We are not bound by predetermined narratives. We are free to define our own purpose. So even if the human mind is inclined toward belief, that does not mean belief is required.
What this discussion reveals is not just a disagreement about religion, but a deeper question about human nature. Why do we search for meaning? Why do we feel drawn toward something beyond ourselves? Across cultures, across history, across intellectual traditions, this pattern repeats. Perhaps belief is not merely taught. Perhaps it is awakened.